The defendant has not attended court today. He has given us his excuse that he suffers from back pain, which is exacerbated by travelling in the secure van. He gave that same excuse on various days during the trial, but repeated inquiries with the healthcare unit at His Majesty's Prison Belmarsh confirm that the defendant's back pain is controlled by painkillers and he is fit to attend court. I have no hesitation in finding that his non-attendance is voluntary, and it is appropriate to sentence him in his absence. The defendant's decision not to attend may in fact be some relief to the family of John Mackey, because the defendant's disruptive conduct during the trial was, I know, a source of great distress to them. The defendant falls to be sentenced today for murder and for robbery. He has also been committed to this court for sentence for a separate offence of theft, having been convicted in his absence in the Magistrates' Court. The simple facts of that matter are that on the 3rd of May of 2025, the defendant stole a backpack containing a mobile telephone while its owner was playing baseball a short distance away. John Mackey was 87 years old when he was killed. He had no children of his own, but he had 22 nephews and nieces who plainly adored him. His niece Patricia spoke on behalf of all of them in court this morning. She said Uncle John was the perfect uncle, funny, charming, mysterious, and very definitely mischievous. He always had a twinkle in his eye, dressed immaculately, and was never seen without one of his many trilby hats. He was always interested in our lives, taking us to see his beloved Arsenal, or introducing us to the pubs of his home patch, Manor House and Finsbury Park. Family was everything to John. He was never happier than when he was with his brothers and sisters, as he was one of 11. There was always so much laughter and storytelling when they were together. He had lived a happy and fulfilled life, unhindered and without incident, until that fateful day. For him to be taken from us in such a way is difficult for us to comprehend. He was a well-known, popular and respected member of the community, but was still remembered in his hometown in Callan, as demonstrated by the number of people at his funeral, all with a story to tell about the lovely, kind, generous gentleman that was John Mackey. He was a one-off, and we will remember him always with love and a smile. Peter Augustine killed this gentle, innocent man. He attacked Mr Mackey for a box of cornflakes, a pint of milk, and a saveloy sausage. I have no doubt that if the defendant was genuinely starving and had asked Mr Mackey for help, this kind, generous gentleman would have shared what he had with him. On the 6th of May of 2025, at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, John Mackey left his flat and made his way to the Co-op in Seven Sisters Road. He bought a box of cornflakes, a pint of milk, and a copy of the Daily Mirror. Then he made his way to a takeaway shop and bought a saveloy sausage and some chips. He packed everything away carefully in his black hold-all bag before making his way slowly back towards his flat. The defendant watched Mr Mackey all the time he was in the takeaway shop. The defendant told the jury that he was hungry and wanted a kebab. He thought of going in and grabbing one and running away, but there were police cars about, and so he decided not to do that. Instead, he followed John Mackey for some distance as he made his way home. He waited until Mr Mackey entered a secluded space in the park that was ringed with hedges, and then the defendant attacked this frail gentleman. There were no witnesses to the start of the attack, but there were witnesses who saw the later part of it. They described seeing the defendant punching Mr Mackey repeatedly with considerable force, and one of them heard the defendant shouting, "Give me the bag, give me the bag." One of the witnesses also described what he said was a stomping movement on the part of this defendant. Mr Mackey had suffered multiple areas of impact trauma to the head, neck and body. He had external bruising and abrasions, deep muscle bruising, 2 rib fractures and a bleed on the brain. He died from his injuries on the 8th of May. I'm sure that what happened was that the defendant tried to grab Mr Mackey's bag. He hung on to it and the defendant lost his temper. punching Mr Mackey in the head and body with severe force, far in excess of what was necessary to steal the bag. The defendant's conduct during the trial demonstrated that he is a man incapable of controlling his temper. He refused to attend the trial for much of the time, but when he was in the courtroom, he was disruptive, shouting angrily from the dock on a regular basis. He was insulting, abusive, and aggressive when prosecution counsel attempted to challenge his account of events. His behaviour was so extreme that after repeated warnings, I had to take the rare step of excluding him from the court, despite the fact that he was in the middle of giving evidence. His behaviour increased the distress and anguish of Mr Mackey's family as they sat with quiet dignity throughout the trial. The defendant's legal team quite rightly arranged for him to be assessed by a psychiatrist, but the defendant refused to attend the appointment. There's nothing in his medical records to show that he's ever been engaged with any form of mental health services. Peter Augustine was born on the 25th of October of 1966 and is now 59 years old. When he was much younger, he was convicted of offences involving serious violence, including robbery and causing grievous bodily harm with intent. He was not convicted of any further offences for more than 2 decades, but since 2016, he's been convicted of racially aggravated public order offences, assault, criminal damage, and theft. The only sentence that the law allows for an offence of murder is one of life imprisonment. I must set a minimum term in accordance with paragraph 3 of Schedule 21 to the Sentencing Act of 2020. That is the term that the defendant must serve before he can be considered for release. It should be clear to everyone that this figure is just the minimum, and it will only be when the parole board considers the defendant is no longer a risk that he could be released. I must first identify a starting point by reference to the seriousness of the offence of murder and the offence of robbery, which is associated with it. If I were to conclude that the seriousness was particularly high, the starting point would be one of 30 years. The prosecution submit that this is such an offence, since this was a murder carried out in the course of a robbery, and the statute suggests that a murder done in the course of a robbery is one example of a case which would normally attract a starting point of 30 years. Miss Dempster, King's Counsel, on behalf of the defendant, accepts that this case carries a great many aggravating factors, but submits that these features do not in themselves justify a finding of particularly high seriousness. My attention has been drawn to the decisions of the Court of Appeal Criminal Division in the Queen against Healy 2008 EWCA Crim 2583 and the Queen against Walton 2022 EWCA Crim 4312. Neither of those cases directly address the specific point that arises here, but the court in both observed that some murders, such as those committed in the course of planned or professional robberies, or committed for high financial stakes, are of a much greater gravity than others, and that room has to be made in the sentencing process for every type of case. Often, whichever starting point is chosen, the eventual minimum term might lie in between 2 starting points. In this case, the defendant followed John Mackey for some minutes with the intention of stealing his food. I am satisfied that the defendant did not, at that stage, intend to use any violence to do so. I am also sure that the defendant could have achieved his objective without the need for such a ferocious attack on a frail, elderly man. The attack was carried out to steal the bag, but the extreme violence that was used was because the defendant lost his temper when the bag was not readily handed over. In other words, I cannot be sure that the killing of Mr Mackey was done for gain, although the attack may have begun for that purpose. Furthermore, the case does not carry features of very high gravity, such as the use of weapons, planning, and high rewards that are seen in the most serious of cases. In those circumstances, I take 15 years as the starting point. However, that is not the end point. Every case turns on its own facts, and detailed consideration of aggravating or mitigating factors may, in all cases, result in a minimum term of any length, whatever the starting point. There are very significant aggravating factors present here. The robbery is an aggravating feature of the murder. John Mackey was particularly and obviously vulnerable because of his age and limited mobility. He was also in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. I have no doubt that the defendant targeted him specifically because he was frail. It was a cowardly attack. The defendant has shown no remorse. Excessive violence was used against John Mackey. He must have suffered pain and fear during an attack that lasted for several seconds and which was accompanied by loud shouting on the part of the defendant, such as he displayed in court in the course of the trial. The defendant's previous convictions for offences involving violence are an aggravating factor, although I bear in mind that some of them were committed many years ago, and none of them is as grave as this attack. There is little in the way of mitigation. I cannot be sure that the defendant intended to kill John Mackey, but punching a frail elderly man, especially to the head, is inherently very dangerous, and so there is little mitigation in that. I do not accept the submission made on behalf of the defendant that he must be suffering from an undiagnosed mental illness. He has been offered a psychiatric assessment but declined to attend. There's no evidence either in his medical history or in the observations of the medical professionals at HMP Belmarsh supporting that assessment. The robbery falls into the highest level of culpability because very significant force was used by the defendant. The harm caused is also plainly at the highest level. The starting point, if the robbery stood alone, is accordingly 8 years, with a range of 7 to 12 years imprisonment. I come then to the sentences in this case. The sentence I passed for the theft committed on the 3rd of May of 2025 is one of 4 weeks imprisonment. The sentence I passed for the robbery of John Mackey is one of 8 years imprisonment. Those two sentences have been taken into account in setting the minimum term for the offence of murder. They will be served concurrently with that minimum term. The sentence I passed for the murder of John Mackey is one of life imprisonment. The minimum term that he must serve before he will be considered by the parole board will be one of 23 years. The defendant has spent 203 days on remand, which will count towards his sentence, and so the minimum term is 23 years less 203 days. Accordingly, I set the minimum term that he must serve at 22 years and 162 days. The defendant will not be released at the end of that term unless the parole board conclude that he no longer poses a risk of harm to the public. That day may never come. If the information with which I've been provided as to the days on remand proves to be inaccurate, then the prosecution or defence must notify the court so that the case can be relisted to correct the calculation as soon as possible, and in any event within 56 days. The victim surcharge applies and will be calculated and collected administratively. I would like to thank all counsel for their calm professionalism throughout the trial, and finally I pay tribute to and thank the family of John Mackey for the dignified patience that they have shown throughout what was and continues to be an especially painful and distressing time. I'm very grateful to you all.